Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to talk about all of the books that I read in the month of July, and I did a lot of reading in the month of July. I finished 11 physical books, 5 audiobooks, and only 4 audiobooks. As you can tell, I was in a physical book mood. 4 of those physical books were actually library books that I borrowed from my library, which I didn't need to do because I have a ton of physical books on my shelf. I did read a lot of physical books on my shelf as well, and I will go through all of that, and then I also knocked some books off of my Kindle as well. So without further ado, I have my trusty reading journal, and we are going to get started with the books that I read in July. So the first book that I read in July was a physical book, The Long Game. This one was off of my physical TBR, and I just was in the mood for a quick romance, and I actually read this entire book on July 1st. This was just exactly what I was wanting to read at the time. It sucked me in, and I just wanted to keep reading, and so I sat down and read it in one day. I enjoyed the story, and I just had a really fun time, and it was exactly what I was looking for. I've also read by this author before, and I enjoyed her other book as well, so I will probably continue to read more by this author. And then I started another book on July 1st, another physical book. I decided that I needed to go to bed, so I didn't finish until July 2nd, and that is Mate by Ali Hazelwood. I have this book borrowed out, so I don't have it with me right now, but I will pop a picture up here. I went out and bought the second book when I finished Bride in June, but there was other books that I wanted to read and get done with, so I put this one off, and then I was still in the mood for like that romance after I finished The Long Game, so I wanted to read this one. I enjoyed this one as well. I love Ali Hazelwood's writing, and I think I am fully caught up on all the Ali Hazelwood books. I would have to double check, but I do believe that I have read all of her books at this point, so I don't have any more on my backlist, which I really enjoy. Then I couldn't really decide what I wanted to read next, so I picked up a short story on my Kindle called Lift Me Up. This just gave me a quick win. I wasn't sure what I wanted to read, and so I could just knock another book off of my Kindle TBR. The story's fine. It was nothing memorable. I have found that short stories either don't work for me or they work for me. Like, I don't really have much middle ground. Like, they're either really not for me or I really enjoy them. Like, I enjoyed the Shell Collector short story collection, and I think maybe I prefer a short story collection over individual short stories, but I do have quite a few short stories on my Kindle. I found this book, or like the premise of this book, kind of annoying and very like surface level. I think there's a lot that an author can do in a short story to take it a little bit deeper, but the writing style was also not for me. The next book that I finished was another physical book. This was a library book, and a book that had been on my to-read list for a very long time, and it is Pioneer Girl by Laura Ingalls Wilder. This is an annotated autobiography about her life and kind of the inspiration behind her Little House books, and I loved Little House in the Big Woods, Little House on the Prairie as a kid. I was obsessed with it. I wanted to live in that time period. Even like my American Girl doll was the one that was from that time period. So I really loved this. And in the end of June, we actually went to one of the Laura Ingalls Wilder museums. There's quite a few, and so I got to kind of live out my childhood dream then, and I had already had this book checked out from the library, and I started it when we got back from that trip. So I just feel like I read this book at the right time, and I really enjoyed my time reading it, and to step back into that piece of my childhood that I loved. The next book that I finished was another ebook. This one was Honeymoon Phase. And I just was on a little bit of like a romance reading kick at the beginning of July. And then this also finishes up like the main part of a series by this author, but then there's like other books in the same world. I'm not sure, but I know this one chunk of books is the last one with it, I think. I would have to look. And this was a friends to lovers romance, which is my favorite like romance trope, so this really worked for me, and it was just really easy to step back into a world that I already knew, and I knew a lot of the characters, so I had fun reading it, and it was exactly what I was looking for at that time. The next book that I finished was my first audiobook that I finished in the month of July. Actually started this one in June, and I needed to finish up because the hold was becoming due. I listened to this on audio from Libby, and it was Icon and Inferno, which is the second book in a duology by Marie Lu. And so this is working towards my finishing series goal. I wasn't really in an audiobook mood, but I needed to finish up my hold. And like the first book in this duology, it wasn't my favorite. I have other books by this author that I enjoy more. I just didn't really care or connect with the characters at all. This did skew a little bit more young adult. So I just don't think this duology was for me, but I really enjoyed the author's writing style, so I think I will continue to pick up books by this author because I do like her writing, and I have liked her other pieces of work. The next book that I finished was another physical book from the library. It was The White Darkness. This is another book that was on my TBR list for quite a while, and this is a nonfiction book about a man's trek through Antarctica in like the 20-teens, I believe, but there's a lot more to his story about that, and it was a very short book. It also had pictures in it, and I just found the story very compelling, and I'm glad that I got to read this book off my list, and also just gave that little bit of sense of adventure that can be found in life, even through challenging things. The next book that I finished was another audiobook. This is one that I had on hold, and it's a recent release. It is The Fatal Unpleasantness at Netherfield. This is part of the Mr. Darcy and Miss Tilney series, so I'm caught up on that series. I believe there will be more books this author's writing in this series, and so this audio hold came available on Libby, and I enjoy these books. They're easy mysteries to listen to, and they follow a very similar format, so it doesn't take a lot of brain power, and like I said, I enjoy the storytelling, and I'm excited to continue to listen to these in the future. The next book that I finished was another physical book. It was Appalachian Elegy by Bell Hooks. This is actually a poetry collection, and we read this one for my professional book club group, and I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed our discussion about it. The poetry style isn't really my favorite poetry style, but we had really great discussion about place and belonging and community and all of those things, so I enjoyed dipping into a work that I don't typically, and reading a genre that I don't typically find myself reading. So I enjoyed the discussion that we had about this, and I think that it helped deepen my understanding of this, and I do think that this is meant to be discussed. The next book that I finished was another short story. I was really trying to get some Kindle books done and check some of those off of my Kindle, and again, I just was kind of in between what I wanted to read and wanted some more quick wins. It was When We Were Friends by Jane Green. And the reason that I picked this one up actually is because I accidentally marked it red on my Kindle when I was scrolling through. So then I was like, well, I might as well read it because it's a short story anyway. And this story was unremarkable, dull, and honestly pointless. So it was something that honestly, if I'd never come across, it would have been fine. I wrote in my notes here, this is something that doesn't need to exist as a story. So I think I rated this 1 star. I really did not enjoy this, and I'm glad that it no longer needs to exist on my Kindle. The next book that I finished was another audiobook. This one I listened to on Spotify. And this was Spare by Prince Harry. This is one that I had on my TBR list for a while as well. And when I looked at the loan wait time on Libby, it is a very long time. So I thought I'll use my Spotify audiobook hours for this because I really didn't have anything else on my radar at the time. And what was really interesting about the autobiography, memoir, whatever you want to call it, was that I really viewed it, especially some of the childhood stuff, through my lens as an educator, and things that I understand as an adult and seeing in kids and things that were happening. So I found that really interesting. I also enjoy when memoirs, autobiographies are narrated by the author. I feel like there's way more connection to the storytelling to hear somebody's words telling their own story. And I was finally able to check this book off of my list. The next book that I read was another physical book. This one was borrowed to me and I've already returned it to its owner. It was The Valley of Amazement. My mom borrowed me this book about a year ago, a little over a year ago, and I wasn't really sure what to expect with it. I knew the setting took place in Shanghai, which I was interested in because that is some place that I have been, so I could relate to some of those places or see some of those locations in my mind. The setting of this does take place in the early 1900s. So I did find the chapters of this book really long, they were very long chapters. However, it made sense for the structure of the story because each chapter tells a definitive section of the character's life. It's told from the perspective mostly of one woman, but also her mother is the main character of some other chapters, so told from her perspective as well. So I found that interesting, but it took me a little bit to push and get into it. However, I did enjoy my time reading this, and again, it was that dip back a little bit into historical fiction, which I've been enjoying a little bit more lately. The next book that I read was an ebook that I checked out from the library. It was The Perks of Being a Wallflower. This is a book that has been on my want to read list for a very, very long time. I think since I first got Goodreads, so years and years and years ago, one of the first books that I marked as want to read. So I'm glad that I finally read it. I didn't realize that this was told in a series of letters, which I found structurally very interesting. and I liked that format. I found it like refreshing after reading something that had really long chapters, and through that storytelling style I felt like I could actually connect to the characters. And I finally checked a book that has been on my want to read list for a very long time off, which was exciting for me. I'm really like trying to work through books that I've been wanting to get to, as well as my physical TBR, which you can kind of see above me. Okay, we are getting to the end, almost. So we have a few more books to talk about. The next book that I read was another physical book. It was How the Word is Passed. This is a book that I've had on my shelf for a while. My mom passed it along to me, but it is one that I am adopting into my collection because it was one of the Go Big Read books. I think it's the Go Big Read copy that she got in 2022. So I was scared to read this book. I don't know why. It was just like intimidating. But once I started reading, I realized I was in a huge nonfiction mood, and I actually read this book fairly quickly. I think it took me like 2 days to read this. And it is a history of reckoning with slavery in the United States, told through places, which I found really interesting structurally, and it made me want to keep reading. I found his writing style really easy to read, and like I said, was in a big nonfiction mood reading this, and I still kind of am. I recently picked up the 1619 Project, which is also a history of slavery in the United States. So I've already made some connections, and I'm not very far into that book. But I really enjoyed this book, and I think the perspective in it is really important, and I think this is something that more people should read. And I feel like I learned a lot from it, which is what I want from my nonfiction books. The next book that I read was another short story on my Kindle, because I wanted something to read on my Kindle, but again, I didn't really know what I wanted to read, so I said, let's pick a short story. Another short story, start checking these off, and I picked up John Gribble is Gone. So I got this one from the First Reads program, and I believe this one came out in August. So I got to read it a little bit early. I actually liked the pacing of this short story. I felt like it was really sticking to a lane and not trying to do too much. I did find pieces of it a bit predictable. However, I had fun reading it, and it was what I wanted, and the twist at the end I enjoyed. So the pacing was good, the structure I think was good, and it was exactly kind of what I was looking for out of a book on my Kindle when I didn't really know what I wanted to read next. The next book that I read was another physical book that I checked out from the library, so I no longer have it. This is The Holiday Swap. This is one that was on my TBR list. So when I went to the library, I only checked out books from my TBR list, and I'm not one who needs to read books in like the season that they're set, so I will read a Christmas romance whenever. I wanted another like fast fun romance, however that is not what this was. The writing style wasn't my favorite. It ended up being more about the relationship between the sisters in this book versus like the romantic relationships that were happening. Those felt more secondary, so I didn't really get what I was expecting out of this book, so it took me a little bit longer to read it, and it didn't like fulfill that like reading a romance book like I was hoping. And like I said, I really didn't like the writing style, and this is written by two authors under like a pseudonym. So I don't know if I'd read any more by these authors, like even their like separate stuff, because the writing style felt very disjointed. The next book that I finished was another audiobook. It was Justice Hall, which is another, and I listened to this book on Libby. My hold came available finally, and this is in the Mary Russell series. I am finding this series very similar to the Outlander series in the way that it is a good background listen. This is another series that the structure of the stories is very predictable. Like it has, every book has a very similar structure, and there are like 21 books or something in this series. So I'm going to be working on this audiobook series for a very long time. And I think she's even still releasing more, or recently has released more. So there's always a mystery element to the book, but that doesn't feel like the driving force like you would expect in like a Sherlock Holmes retelling. But each mystery doesn't really drive the story forward as much as like the long overview story of the series, or like the plots of the series are more driving it forward, if that makes sense. But I'm gonna still keep continuing this series. It's a perfect background series. It will take me forever to finish because the audiobook holds are always like weeks, months out. But I know when I finally finish the series, I am going to feel extremely accomplished. The next book that I read was another physical book, another library book, The Fervor. This is one that was on my want to read list, like I said before, and it is a historical horror about Japanese internment in the United States during World War II. I found this book very compelling, and I wanted to keep reading next to kind of understand what that horror element was going to be and how all the different perspectives that were happening were going to converge, because you were getting multiple perspectives and you're getting little pieces here and there about different things, and then they all started to converge, and I really enjoyed that storytelling style, and I am glad that I read this and I can finally check it off of my list. 2 more books. I finished 2 more books in the month of July, and they are both physical books. The next book that I finished was How Minds Change. This is another book that was just intimidating to me, but once I picked it up and started reading it, I was like, why was I intimidated by this? So this one has been on my shelf for a while, and what I was hoping this book would be was not what it was. I found it quite boring. The writing style is quite boring. I think the first chapter or so was good, and then the rest I just kind of had to power through. And even though I was in a nonfiction reading mood, this really dragged. I found this overall very disappointing and not very memorable, which is interesting because it's all about like thinking. So I'm glad it's finally off my shelf, off my TBR shelf, and I can't believe I was intimidated to read this because there was nothing intimidating about it. And the final book that I read in the month of July, number 20 that I finished, was This Is How It Always Is. This is a book that was borrowed to me by someone because it is up there with one of their favorite books. And I can see why this story really resonated with the person who borrowed this to me. However, I found the writing style very overwritten and disjointed. And I just, because of how overwritten it was, I couldn't connect with any of the characters. And I feel like this story is very character driven. So I found it very challenging to get through, and I really had to push myself through. I am glad that I read it though, and that I get to check it off my list and return it to its owner. So those are the 20 books that I finished in the month of July. Thank you so much for sticking with this very long video, and I will see you next time. Bye.